So, Philippians 4, and we'll read verses 10 through to 20. And some of you will be familiar with these verses because these verses provide us with the reason for the letter. We'll come in due course, no doubt, to look at this epistle. So we're having a kind of preview this morning then. So, Philippians 4, verses 10 through to 20. Now, I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that at last your care for me has flourished again, though you surely did care all along, but simply lacked the opportunity to show it. Not that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. I know how to be abased, and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things, I have learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer loss. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Nonetheless, you've done well in that you shared with me in my distress. And so you, Philippians, know also that in the beginning of the gospel, when I left for Macedonia, no church shared with me concerning giving and receiving, but you only. And even in Thessalonica, you sent aid once and again for my necessities. Now, not that I seek the gift, but I seek the fruit that abounds to your account. Indeed, I have all and abound. I am full, having received from Epaphroditus the things sent from you, a sweet-smelling aroma, an acceptable sacrifice, well-pleasing to God. And my God shall supply all your need according to his riches in glory by Christ Jesus. And so to our God and Father be glory forever and ever. Amen. So this epistle is basically a thank you letter from Paul to the church at Philippi. But Paul has to tread a very careful line. He wants to say thank you for the gift that he's received from them. So it's a financial gift. But at the same time, he wants to demonstrate to the church at Philippi that God is sufficient to meet all his needs. Paul has to show that he is dependent on others for his needs to be met, and yet that God is sufficient to him in all things. So Paul has a balancing act to do. And in these 10 verses, he finally gets to the point where he feels he can say thank you. But it's a very muted, very tortuous thank you, because he's struggling to find that balance between showing them that he's grateful because he needed the gift, but at the same time, he wants to demonstrate that God meets and supplies all his needs. So it's a very tricky thing for Paul to do. And what I want to do this morning, given that context, is to look at a verse that many people, many of you, have had a troubled relationship with over the years. And it's also a verse that has been misused in the Christian church over the centuries. And that is verse 11. So be brave now, bear with me. Let's take a look at this verse. Philippians 4, verse 11. Not that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. Now that's the verse. The phrase then, no surprise, that we're going to look at this morning is, I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. And we'll focus specifically on the word content. Now you can see straight away, can't you, how this word is a word that we can feel troubled by. It's a word that can often condemn us, make us feel bad. about ourselves, about our thoughts, our desires, our experience. But it's not meant to do that at all. It's something that Paul wants the church at Philippi to understand. And you can see why. If he's saying that he's learned to be content, how difficult it is for Paul to say thank you to them for the gift that they sent to him. So we're going to look at this word, and I want to do it like this. Let's look at the word itself and its meaning. I then want to think about, when is Paul content? And finally, perhaps most importantly, how is he able to be content? So usual threefold structure: the meaning, the application, when is he, and the explanation, how is he. But let's begin by thinking about Paul himself. And Paul is experiencing, when he writes this epistle, he's experiencing his own lockdown. Paul is in prison, and Paul is dependent on the goodwill of others. So what we've heard recently from Shukin in Bangladesh, what we heard on Wednesday from Joan in South Africa, has reminded me of Paul at this moment in his life. Paul is under house arrest, so he's not able to leave his house. And as such, Paul needs others to come to him and to bring him food parcels, to bring him clothing, to bring him books, to bring him pen and paper that he might write his letters. So Paul is in a situation that in so many ways is similar to that which many people are finding themselves in today. And if people didn't visit Paul or send him parcels, Paul would have been in a very, very difficult position. He was completely reliant on the goodwill of others. And so you see the situation that he's in then. He needs others, but he wants to be living proof that God will supply all his needs. And he wants to be a living demonstration of what it means to be content. So Paul really is agonizing over how to demonstrate in his own experience the reality of the sufficiency of God, whilst he very much needs others and is very dependent on the gifts and the goodwill of Christian people. So that's the context then, Paul's own lockdown, if you like. And so here he says then, verse 10, I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that you now at last has had an opportunity to show your care for me. Now that's a verse that's tinged with a note of bitterness, because the church at Philippi had taken a long time to send Paul any parcels, any relief, any money. And Paul has felt that very deeply. He's been hurt by the length of time the church has taken to show any evidence of their concern for Paul. And Paul, locked down in this house, if you like, has had plenty of time to think, to mull things over. And one of the things that's troubled him is this seeming lack of care from the church at Philippi. And so in verse 10, he's saying to them, oh, at last then, you sent me a gift. Oh, and I'm really sure that you would have sent it earlier if you'd had the chance to do so, but you weren't able, were you? So there's a note there of bitterness, a note of sarcasm, if you wish, in verse 10. And then he has to kind of flip-flop a little bit and say the opposite, verse 11, not that I speak in regard to need. I didn't need your gift. I wasn't kind of suffering because you hadn't sent me your gift. For I have learned, in whatever state I am, to be content. Now let's get to this word then, shall we? It's a great word. It's a word that Paul will use on more than one occasion. And the basic meaning of the word, and this is where we so often go wrong, isn't it? The basic meaning of the word is independence. It's self-sufficiency. So Philippians 4 and verse 11, Philippians 4, verse 11, I have learned in whatever state I am to be sufficient. I have learned in whatever state I am to be independent. I have learned to be enough. So this word, it's the Greek word autarkes. Okay, this word has a proud history in Greek culture. And this word was used again and again in the philosophy clubs and in the academies, in all the schools, are autarkes. How can we be self-sufficient? And Paul takes this word and he uses it to discuss his own Christian experience. What does the word mean then? What I want you to do this morning is think about externals and internals. Externals, all the things that happen around us, the things that happen to us. So think about circumstances, think about events, think about situations, think about experiences, think about everything that is an external. So you can think about the house you live in, you can think about the days of the week, you can think about the events that unfold during the course of a week, you can think about other people. There's externals. Now think about how often the external things of life determine how you are. The external realities determine our well-being. They influence and shape our sense of our own well-being. So if things are going well, we feel fine. If things are going badly, we get distressed, we might get anxious, we might get sad. We have the external life and the impact of that life on us. That's the externals. Now, by contrast, think about your inner life. Think about your insides, your thoughts, your values, your beliefs, your emotions, your inner self, your inner realities, the truths, if you like, that you build your life upon. Now, the word content means that our inner reality determines our well-being rather than our external experiences. Now, I got no way of knowing whether this is making sense to you guys, okay? Some of you haven't got your videos on, others have. So I'm going to kind of guess that I might need to explain this a few times. So bear with me if you've already understood what I'm saying, and if you haven't, that's no worries either. The word wants you to think about the relationship, the word content, think about the relationship between your external life and your internal life, which is in control for you. Which does your well-being rely on? Is your sense of well-being based on what's happening around you? Or is your well-being rooted in your inner world and your inner life, your inner experience? Now, contentment, self-sufficiency, autarkes, this Greek word, means that the inner world, your inner experience, is that upon which you base your well-being. So that whatever goes on externally, your inner world shapes and impacts and sustains your well-being. That's what the word itself means. So that whatever Paul's external world, so that's prison in this case, as we've said already this morning, it's his lockdown experience. Whatever goes on, whether he gets a gift off the church at Philippi or not, if he has enough food or not, his inner world, his inner resources are the basis on which his well-being depends. Now, that is what Paul is trying to tell us this morning. And that is what contentment means. So it doesn't mean that you put up with your lot. It doesn't mean that you never complain. It never, ever means that you don't try to make life better for yourself, because of course you should always seek to make life better, to make the externals better. The word means, and this is the last time I'll say it now, guys, okay? The word means that your inner resources and your inner experience is the basis for your well-being. And so what Paul does in these 10 verses, Philippians 4, verses 10 to 20, he's trying to make clear to us what that means. So if you notice, and you see it not just here, you see it in lots of passages, Paul holds two opposite things together at the same time. So you see it, don't you, as you go down into verse 12. He holds contradictions. He knows how to be abased, and he knows how to abound. He knows how to be full, and he knows how to be empty. He knows how to abound, and he knows how to suffer loss. And what we've got to be clear about here is that Paul is telling us that he holds these things at the same time. Now, very often we think Paul means he has periods when he's full and he has periods when he's empty. He has periods of time when he is abounding, and then he has other periods of time when he's abased. Now, that's not what he means at all. He's holding both together at the same time. So he can be full and empty at the same time. He can abound, he can be exuberant, but he can also be abased. He can be low and he can be sad. He's holding both together. And the one is external. So externally, he might be hungry, but internally, he's full. Externally, he may be abased, but internally, he's abounding. Do you get the idea then? That's what contentment is. It's this idea that the externals may be one thing, but the internal reality is another thing. His internal world is not determined by or shaped by or controlled by his external world. Now, this is a huge thing to think about, okay? And all I want to do today is kind of put it out there for you to think about for yourselves. This is what he's telling us, okay? He has learned this. Now, we're very glad, aren't we, that Paul has learned it, okay? So you see it there, don't you, in verse 11. And Paul has used this word learned a couple of times in this epistle. I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. Now, the word learned, we get the name Matthew from the Greek original. And the word means to acquire by habit. It means to practice. It means to be a disciple of. It means to devote yourself to. So Paul is saying, I've made it a habit. I've given myself the task. I've tried to make sure that I have been able to be content. I've made it a lifelong study. It reminds many people, the word learned, of what Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 1. You know, when he talks about the work of faith, the labor of love. It's very much a labor of love. It's a long, slow slog to try and learn this idea of contentment. And so Paul is saying then that it's taken a number of years, no doubt. It's required a lot of effort. It's not been an easy thing. It's been slow. He's made many mistakes, but nonetheless, he has given time and attention to this contentment idea, where the inner world of Paul is where he roots and rests his well-being in. Okay, that's the idea here. So all you've got to do is go to Philippians 4 and verse 9, and he's telling us the same thing. this idea of he's you learn these things. What you've seen in me, you learn. Okay, so that's the idea there. So here's Paul in lockdown, had a gift. He's really glad about the gift, but he's saying, my inner reality is that where I'm resting my well-being in. Now, when is he like this? When is he content? Well, you can see for yourself, can't you? In verse 12. Everywhere and in all things I have learned, so use the word again, to be full and hungry, to abound and to suffer loss. So Paul is saying he is like this, he is content, he is, if you like, sufficient, he's independent, whatever, in all situations and at all times. He can hold together these opposites in his experience: hungry, full, abasing, and abounding. He's learned it in every situation. Now, here's the big question. How is he able to do it? Okay? And you get that how in verse 13. So do you see how the progress is taking place in these verses? What is he? Verse 11, he's content. When is he? Verse 12, in everything, in every situation. How is he? Well, the how is verse 13. I can do all these things through Christ who strengthens me. The how is Christ who strengthens me. And this word strengthen, it refers to inner experience. So you may have come across phrases in the New Testament like being strengthened in the inner man. Well, that's what this word means, okay? There are a number of Greek words that we can translate as strengthen. The most famous of them is dunamis, power. But this is a different Greek word, and it's got the emphasis on internal strength. So it's not so much, muscles. It's not so much to do with external power. It's not to do with strength. This particular word, refers to inner experience, the inner person. And what Paul is saying to us is Christ is the one who gives to me, who supplies for me the inner strength so that my inner world is the root for my well-being. My inner experience supplies my sense of well-being because Christ gives to me and supplies for me that inner resource that I need. And so Paul, like he does elsewhere then, he's putting his attention in the lockdown on Christ. He's focusing his time on who Christ is, what Christ has done for him, the grace of Jesus Christ. That's what Paul is spending these hours of the day dwelling on, reflecting on. And in so doing, Paul's inner world is a world of fullness. Paul's inner world is a place where he abounds because he is knowing, experiencing the supply that Jesus Christ is able to provide for him. So look at that contrast. The Philippian church has taken months to send a gift to Paul. But whilst Paul is in prison, he hasn't had to wait months for Jesus to give him grace, or for Jesus to impart hope, or for Jesus to grant his presence. And so Jesus has been continually infusing. Now, sometimes this word strengthen in verse 13 can be compared to, if you like that kind of thing, to tea. And you put tea into water, and then tea infuses the water. And that's the meaning of the Greek word. Christ infuses Paul's inner life with strength and grace and hope. And Paul experiences that inner sense of being infused by Christ. And so therefore, Paul roots his well-being in that inner experience. Now, I don't know if this makes any sense to us, but I'm simply trying to think about what Paul is saying. So, what he tells us in verse 13 is, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Now, we've got Catherine with us this morning, and Catherine, your husband, used to say to me that he wanted me to do a series on the all things in the New Testament. Do you remember? And Peter would say, Neil, Romans 8:28, I can do all, God works all things together for good. And here is another example of the word all things. It's one word in the Greek. It's the word panta. And it doesn't mean, that Paul can run 100 miles an hour because Christ strengthens him. It doesn't mean that Paul can jump over buildings because Christ strengthens him. The all things, always in the Greek, refers to the things Paul has been talking about. So you don't just need to look at verses 10 through to 20 here. All the things in this epistle that Paul has been talking about, he is able to do because Christ infuses into Paul's inner life the riches of the grace and the resources that Christ has. So just as an example of this, just go back to the beginning of chapter 4. What can Paul do then? What's the all things that Paul can do? Because Christ infuses grace into his inner life. Well, he can stand fast. He can rejoice. Paul can let his gentleness be made known to all men. Paul is anxious for nothing, but in everything, through prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, Paul can, in the lockdown, make his requests known to God. What are the all things Paul can do? In the lockdown, Paul can experience the peace of God, which is beyond understanding, guarding his heart and mind. These are the all things that Paul is able to do because Christ infuses into his inner life. And many of you will know that when Paul writes in chapter 4 about the peace of God guarding his heart and mind, Paul is being guarded, isn't he? Because he's in prison. So it's very likely that Paul would have had a guard on the outside of the house. He may even have had a guard on the outside of the room in which he was writing this epistle. So Paul, you can imagine him, it's not difficult. Paul is sitting at his desk, writing this thank you note to the church at Philippi, and he's doing this balancing act. I don't know if he gets it right, but he's trying to do this balancing act between, look, my inner life is where I root my well-being. My inner world is my reality for me. Christ strengthening me on the inside is what matters to me. But thanks, guys, for your gift. I really appreciate it, and I needed it. You can imagine Paul trying to do that. And as he writes this letter, outside the door is a guard. And that guard is preventing perhaps Paul going out, and the guard may well be preventing others coming in with the view to help Paul escape. And Paul looks at that guard and he says that guard is like the peace of God. The peace of God prevents certain things coming in, these events of life, these external experiences. The peace of God prevents those external things coming in and disturbing my inside life. But that same peace of God stands guard over my insides, allowing my inner life and my inner experience to be at peace. And so very cleverly, it seems to me, he uses this idea of a prison guard to equate that guard, that being kept, being protected, with the role that the peace of God has in our experience. So this is Paul. Tell me what you think. Does he succeed in saying thank you to the church at Philippi and at the same time saying, my inner life is the source of all my well-being? It's a hard thing that he seeks out to do. But what I want us to take from this is, what are you emphasizing in your own experience during our lockdown? Are you focusing your attention on the externals, the limitations of being in a lockdown, the restrictions that are very much part of life? Are you focusing your attention on the loss of freedom that we are experiencing? And so you're looking at those things, and you're taken up with, your mind is filled with the externals of life. And so your well-being is flowing from the external realities that we're currently facing. Or during this lockdown, is your focus on who Christ is, how he is able to supply our every need, to minister his grace, to strengthen the inner man, so that our well-being flows from the inside out, not from the outside in. Now there you go. Contentment. Contentment is when our well-being flows from the inside out, not from the outside in. So that's what I want us to reflect on. But at the same time, when we reflect on this, we'll be in a position a bit like the Apostle Paul, because we'll still need other people. And whatever lockdown is like for you, just like it is for Paul, he needs others. And he needs the support that others give. He needs the gifts that others can bring. He needs the food that others can supply him. So he still needs all those things, even though he's looking for the inside to flow out. And so he's in a tricky position. So never lose sight of the fact that contentment is still a tricky position to be in. It will always mean that there's an element in which we need others and we need them to supply needs. But the emphasis on the word is this inside, internal, flowing out of our sense of well-being. That's contentment, everyone. Will you